More than any policy, you have to believe deep in your soul that this is the greatest country, that it's a country that fundamentally aspires to overcoming difference, and that we're making progress.
Well, hello out there in podcast land. This is a new edition of the Liberal Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, Rui Teixeira, and every couple of weeks I come at you with the very finest and heterodox political conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today I'm pleased as punch to have Congressman Khanna, who is a House rep from the 17th District of California, which is basically Silicon Valley. Roe abandoned his law career for politics and was elected in 2016, along with a certain prominent politician who will probably come up once or twice in the course of our conversation. He's a leading progressive voice in Congress, but one who's deeply concerned, and I, of course, really approve of this, with the people in flyover country and how we can stop leaving left behind areas, well, behind. He's the author of a very interesting book, Progressive Capitalism, How to Make Tech Work for All of Us, also called, I think at one point, Dignity in the Digital Age. And we'll talk about some of the ideas in his book, as well as some of your ideas, Ro, in your recent articles and interviews. Now, just touching on the book for a second, you argue that we can make tech work for all of us, including in left behind areas, and that's the key to a new progressive majority. Now, you know, obviously probably been asked this before, but a lot of the ideas in your book did seem to inform or were coincident with a lot of the things the Biden administration did. And I know you're really involved in the IRA, and yet the Democrats, of course, did worse in this last election among working class, left behind areas. So what's your take on that? Why did the Biden sort of attempt to do what you were recommending seem to fall flat with these voters?
Well, Rui, first of all, thank you for letting me on your podcast, inviting me on. I'm a fan of your writing, and I highly recommend everyone read a lot of what you've written. Even when I disagree, it helps inform me. And as my brother said, 2016 was the year anyone could get elected, although I think our assessment of Trump has probably changed, as that it wasn't as coincidental. Let me just say this about Biden. I think he was in the right direction of wanting to build new industry in communities that have been left out. There were three mistakes. One was execution. The execution just wasn't there. Some of the money was doled out towards the end of his term. There weren't people who were focused on measurable results. Secondly, the money was not targeted to places like Johnstown, Downriver, Michigan, Galesburg, Warren. Columbus got a steel factory, but Columbus already is thriving in Ohio. I mean, it's great, but the places that
the only place in Ohio that's thriving.
It's got Google, it's got JP Morgan. Right. So it wasn't as targeted. Third, we never asked the communities what they wanted. I mean, not everyone is going to want a battery plant or want a semiconductor plant, nor can you put that everywhere. And some communities said, what about modern steel? What about modern aluminum? What about shipbuilding? We should have been a little bit more meat and potatoes in the actual industry. And fourth, we should have gotten the private sector. So one of the things I'm going to be doing is opening AI academies with OpenAI in some of these communities. And people say, oh, do they really want it? I said, have you gone to some of the factory towns? Like they want manufacturing and steel, but they also understand that their kids are going to have jobs in the future. And of course, they want to see private sector industry as well, and in industries that are going to produce wealth. And we didn't cooperate enough with the private sector. So overall, directionally correct, but could have been implemented in a much more forward-looking, inspiring, community-driven way.
Right. Well, that sounds reasonable. And let's talk about AI, too, in a second, because I think that's interesting. But just to drill down a little bit on what you were just saying, I mean, the first thing you mentioned was execution. Now, doesn't a lot of this have to do with sort of a failure to twin the spending with regulatory and permitting reform and other ways in which, to grease the wheels of the system so stuff actually gets done and gets done fast? Do you see that as a big problem? I know that's a big theme of our friends in the abundance agenda sort of movement.
I do. I mean, I think Ezra Klein is right, for example, to point out about the failure of the California high-speed rail. I mean, started in 2008 and still haven't completed Bakersfield to Merced. So, yeah, there's the issue of state capacity, but it's not as simple as let's just have permitting reform. It's how are we going to have measurable results? How are we going to have people in these positions who are going to focus on execution? How are we going to say, look, we're going to 6-month timeline, 1-year timeline, we're going to get it done. And we shouldn't be allergic to the private sector in partnering with them to build a new industry or new jobs. And so I do think that the execution lacked was something that could have been improved. And then, the other issue is that we often tend to have a too academic a view. A lot of people in the working class and in these communities, they admire business leaders and wealth. It's one of the reasons when Trump and Elon Musk were going through Pennsylvania, they had the kind of reception they did. And so I think we have to say, look, the government has a very important role, but we're going to also have business leaders help rebuild some of these areas.
Yeah, well, of course, I agree with that. And, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson would agree with that, lots of other people. But here's a problem that I thought I'd put to you.
Yeah.
I think let's put it this way, if I was a Republican, which I'm not, I'd probably say, well, okay, great, Roe. You want to, sort of get rid of all the obstacles to getting stuff done. You want things to be done fast and effectively. But, we're the party that's actually going to get rid of these obstacles. We're actually taking action. And, Democrats don't take action because there's too many interest groups, too many litigators, too many parts of the party that don't want to change the status quo from what it is today. So what would you say to that?
Well, I'd say a lot of their actions have been rhetorical. For example, they claim they want to balance the budgets, and yet they're putting out budgets that would increase $2.8 trillion to the federal deficit. They are going after certain spending that's 3% of the federal workforce with largely veterans, and it doesn't have a rational plan. And the question is, also, it's not just deregulation is not enough. Let's say you have total deregulation on AI, which they want, and deregulation on business investments. How is that going to necessarily create new manufacturing jobs and create jobs in communities where they've been deindustrialized? I just don't think it's enough to have tariff policy and tax cut and deregulation policy to have the kind of economic renewal that we want. Now, they point to TSMC, the $100 billion. Some of that was going to happen anyway. Some of that was facilitated by the CHIPS Act, which was originally a Keith Crush, Donald Trump idea in 2018. I'm not saying that the tariffs didn't play some role, but it wasn't dispositive.
Right. Well, let's talk about AI for a second then, because intriguingly, I think maybe was it in your Times op-ed or the article that's in the Free Press? I can't remember. You talked about you think there needs to be a Manhattan Project for AI. Well, maybe you could. I mean, how would that work? How much would it cost? And is there any chance of any bipartisan cooperation on something like this?
I think three things on AI. One, most of the extraordinary technology developed has been private sector investment in AI and in fusion. But we want AI not just to be for ChatGPT. We want AI to actually help solve diseases. And we want AI to help make energy more abundant. And to do that, we need, in my view, a public sense of purpose. And I think you could have the federal government make that kind of investment. You could have states that, in exchange for compute power, states like Pennsylvania that are rich in energy, say some of that compute power has to go to be used by schools and community colleges and public colleges so that they can have this for developing their kids. And the final point is we need every person having basic training in technology. And this isn't because I want to turn steel workers into coders. It's because steel workers are going to have to know how to operate machines, and electricians are. And we are failing our young people in America by not giving them basic technology like we give them reading and math.
Yeah. No, I hear that. Actually, I kind of segue from that into the issue of sort of the big entrepreneurs, the tech people themselves, the tech zillionaires, Elon Musk. I thought you made an important point a little earlier in our talk when you said, a lot of people admire these. They may dislike Elon Musk's personality, for example, or some of the things he's doing, but fundamentally they admire people like that who can actually make stuff happen and build empires and so on. Do you think this is a problem with the Democrats at this point, that they're basically just disparaging any billionaire who's not on the right side, whereas, it's particularly someone like Elon Musk, who despite all his weirdnesses, is a remarkable entrepreneur. And in fact, I think you've been criticized by, I happened to come across this article in the American Prospect Row, which is a left-leaning magazine, and they said there are 10 Democrats who need to be primaried, and the bad news is you're on the list. I guess the good news is you're only number 9 on their hit parade. So what's that about? I couldn't understand what they were saying in the article. Something about Elon Musk and a subpoena, and he hasn't done this or that. I mean, why do they not like you? I don't get it. You're like a really progressive guy, right? So
well, you can't be ever left enough, though. But I am progressive, and I had said some positive things about Musk initially, and I said, look, I would be open initially to working on cuts in the Pentagon because of what he had done with SpaceX. Now, I have been very critical of Musk, and he's called me a dick recently, and because I said he should come to Congress to testify. But I had an American Prospect op-ed, which they published because they even thought that was pretty silly. Whoever these days they find some 20-some-year-old and they write an article.
Unleash him.
Unleash him. So, but the broader point is this with Musk. I mean, on the one hand, people do admire business leaders, but who they admire more is veterans, and and they admire people who wear the uniform. And I think what the way Musk has gone about this, where a third of the people being fired are veterans, people who've gone to Afghanistan, Iraq. Rui, who cares if they may be 70% efficient and they've served the uniform and they're helping other veterans or at a park service? I mean, not everyone has to be SpaceX productivity working 12 hours a day, especially if they've
sleeping on the floor of their office.
Yeah, especially if they've served the country, which neither I have in that way, nor Musk, nor Trump. And so that's where I think the anger to Musk has really bubbled up. He started with a lot of goodwill, with people saying, yeah, he's a business leader, but business leaders are still secondary to the American project, and certainly secondary to people who serve the country in uniform.
Yeah, well, though, the other side of this, and I think you pointed this out yourself, is that a lot of this stuff that Musk and Doge or whatever are doing seems pretty heinous and not well considered. But on the other hand, the idea the government needs to be in some ways trimmed, made more efficient, rooting out inefficient and wasteful programs. I mean, that's pretty popular. And Democrats have sort of gotten themselves in the position where, like, Doge is just intrinsically an evil enterprise. Whereas I think your position is, the idea is a pretty good one. They're just like screwing it up. But I don't think Democrats are quite getting that across, that they agree that, not all bureaucrats are good, and that we do need to sort of reinvent government, in the mortal words of the Clinton administration. So what's that about? Are the Democrats in danger of just becoming dogmatic anti-Dogers because they're so annoyed at everything that Trump has done and Musk?
Yeah, no, I think that's a danger. I mean, it's why initially I said that there is waste in government, and I would work with Doge in good faith. And I'd put out ideas of where I'd work with them. I mean, the Pentagon budget with 5 prime contractors. Why aren't we having a more competitive process? The fact that you have fossil fuel subsidies still 100 years later. Why do we have that? Why do we have Medicare Advantage upbilling the government in terms of the costs, where they're having billing for people sicker than they actually are? There are a lot of areas, and certainly we need a better state capacity in the country and cut waste and abuse. I just think that the way Musk has gone about doing it has been not actually with the going after the holy cows, not going after the big ticket items, and not very well planned out. And so the Democrats should have our own plan on it.
Well, can you enlist people, though, in that kind of crusade? I mean, this gets back to something I was alluding to a few minutes ago. I mean, you argued in your op-ed, I think, in the Times that, we have to see this political moment as partly being driven by this sense among huge sectors of the country that the status quo is just broken, just broken. And they're like groping for something that's different. I mean, are the Democrats really capable of, they are kind of the establishment, right, at this point in many ways? I mean, they're a status quo party. So how can they be the anti or better anti-status quo party to the Republicans when I think their first instinct is simply to defend the status quo?
Well, not all of them, right? Bernie Sanders is out there doing the whole tour.
Right. Well, Bernie is always the exception. God bless him. Yeah.
And, and I co-chaired Bernie's campaign in 2020. But look, there was this cartoon, Rui, you would probably appreciate it, and it had a ship, and it had a big hole in the ship. And you had Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders saying, there's a big hole in the ship. And then you had other people around the ship saying, but it's still a great ship. But the ship is going in the right direction. Oh, but the hole isn't that big. But if you look at it from this angle, the hole doesn't look that menacing. And only Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are saying, no, there's a hole in the ship. And I think this is part of why the Democrats are losing it. Donald Trump has basically said some very basic things. You got screwed. Your jobs went offshore. There are too many people coming across the border without proper border security. And a lot of the Democrats put aside that we didn't necessarily have the right problems. We were denying the problem. And I think the first thing to get people's trust is to state the problem, because then it looks like you know what you're talking about and you know what it's like in their shoes.
Well, speaking of, fixing the hole in the ship, that takes us to solutions. And now you famously advocated a type of economic patriotism and sort of a national development strategy. Didn't you even have a bill with Rubio about a national development council?
Exactly.
So what's that about? Explain a little bit to us about your program and how it would work. And, I think even your best, BFF, Steve Bannon, thought you were onto something with that. So tell us about that, because I do think it's a very intriguing idea.
I think you started with, I was born in Pennsylvania in Bucks County, and my dad was in manufacturing, and I saw what Pennsylvania did for the country. My parents came to this country in the 1960s with Kennedy. Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, won our freedom. They produced more steel than Japan and Germany combined in World War II. And these places where not only kids went, young people, men went, and women went to serve, but also produced the industry that made America America, literally were hollowed out. They were hollowed out because of terrible policies, terrible trade policies that led to jobs going to China and Mexico and elsewhere, offshoring policies, liquidation policies. And what I say is our single focus, highest focus, the Democratic Party needs to be to rebuild America's industrial base, to rebuild these communities' prosperity, and to say here, we see the future and we want your kids, your families to have a place in that future. That means both silicon and steel. It means both chips and ships. It means both the software of AI and the hardware. We need steel, we need chips, we need aluminum, we need the modern version of these things, but we also need the technology jobs that are in these communities, and we need to work with these communities to see what they want and have economic development. And so the Republicans emphasize the regulatory part. And look, I get that it's easier to build in Texas a home than in California, and that needs to change. But there's other parts to it too, right? California has an incredible community college and higher education system, because it takes that as well. It takes workforce development. It takes investments in the skilled trades. It takes financing for scaling factories. And how do we do all of that? And that's what I call for a National Economic Development Council at the White House.
So do you think there's any chance of any of this happening during the Trump administration, or this is essentially aspirational, something that Democrats, should they get back into power, something they would seek to do or would seek to run on? What's your take on that? Is this basically a 2028 kind of idea?
Well, it's aspirational only because the Rubio and others aren't pushing it right now. I hope they would. I mean, I did the bill
Right.
with Marco Rubio.
In theory, J.D. Vance might be in favor of some of this stuff too, right?
And Vance, baby. And look, if
Yeah.
here's a place where I think we could work together: shipbuilding. I mean, the president correctly recognized in the
Right.
State of the Union, China's making 1,700 ships a year. We make 5, and there are
That's a
bills.
difference.
That's a difference. There are bills in
Yeah,
Congress that would incentivize and finance shipbuilding. That if the president comes to with any proposal, which I think is reasonable, on building the industrial base, I would support it. I would work across the aisle. I went to Melania Trump's roundtable. I was the only Democrat who showed up because she supported legislation to take down sexually explicit AI-generated images from the internet. And the bill had passed the Senate 100-0, and yet I'm the only House member who shows up because it was Melania Trump. I think we've got to get past that as oppose Trump where he's wrong, support him where things are good for the American people.
Yeah, that makes sense. I certainly don't think that was the impression people got from watching the State of the Union address, where there wasn't didn't seem to be much interest on the part of Democrats in even, standing up for a kid with brain cancer who gets put into the Secret Service and, some other things like that. I mean, just like everybody can support something like that, right? But the anti-Trump thing has gotten so far that it's just like anything he says, I'm against, right? So I think that's a huge problem, and I think your approach sounds right, but there don't seem to be that many Democrats who are taking it at this point.
I agree with you. I mean, look, I stood up for the boy with cancer, not because of politics, just it was an emotional moment. I mean, it's just follow your basic humanity is a pretty decent rule often in politics. And I stood when the president entered because out of respect for the American people and the country. That doesn't mean that I don't push back very, very strongly and that we should call out things that are unconstitutional. But I guess my point is that you're going to have more credibility to do that if people feel like you're respecting their vote, and if people feel like you're actually trying to move things forward for the country. Then when he tries to exert executive power at the expense of Congress, or when J.D. Vance says, if the Supreme Court rules some way, we should quote Andrew Jackson and say, okay, you made your ruling, now try to enforce it. Then people say, that's really crazy. Yes, we'll listen to you. But you can't cry wolf every time.
Yeah, and that gets kind of to the whole issue, I think, of, who are we? I mean, we are all Americans, so we can't, we do need to try to reach over those divisions as best we can. And obviously the way to do that is with things we do actually agree on, or things that make sense. In your, I believe it was in your op-ed, or maybe in some other thing I read, you talked about Frederick Douglass's concept of composite Americans, which actually is very similar to Albert Murray's concept of omni-Americans, which Ralph Ellison also pushed in the 50s. The idea that, we are many things. We Americans are composed of many cultural and other strands, but that's the way we should think of ourselves, not as part of these different identity groups or however you slice and dice things, but rather, we are composite Americans. And look, if Frederick Douglass could say that and retell that, maybe that's not such a crazy idea.
Roy, I think Frederick Douglass's speech, Composite Nation, is one of the top 5 greatest speeches in American history, along with the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's second inaugural. And it's incredible because Douglass is, after being enslaved, is standing up for the idea of Chinese immigration. And he says the worst parts that people may not like about things that that Chinese culture would bring will dissipate in the free air of America, and the best traditions will become part of this composite nation. And here's what made Douglass's vision so strong. It was not a vision of, what makes America America is just a proceduralism, a sense of that we have a Declaration of Independence and Constitution, or what philosophers like Rawls would say is just a commitment to procedural justice. Douglass aimed for more. He said, this is a country that will have a common history, that will have common aspirations, that will have common goals for science, for what we want to do for the world. And it's a really beautiful vision of America as a nation. And that can be, in my view, our North Star.
Do you think the Democrats are making progress on inching closer to that sort of thing and away from some of the spirit of the early 20s, sort of re-embracing patriotism, re-embracing, I don't know if they certainly wouldn't call it composite Americans, but the idea, trying to get past some of the stuff from a few years ago and sort of really getting back in touch with the fact that patriotism is actually like a really good thing, and we do need to motivate all of our citizens to, if we're interested in doing great projects like the one you were just talking about with economic patriotism and the national development strategy. I mean, it's got to be a patriotic thing, right? I mean, how can it possibly be driven by, congeries of interest groups?
I do think so. I think it's going to take work. There are about 12 of us that Chris Deluzio is leading in the House. It's a group called Economic Patriots, and it's expand the caucus. So we're trying. But I think it's going to be more than just, okay, Democrats need to throw in the word patriotism and throw in the flag. I think we've got to say, look, for the longest time, there weren't enough people who cared about places like Youngstown and Johnstown, and they were busy flying all over the world. And we had policies that thought that globalization was the way that was going to be good for everyone. And a lot of people got shafted, and we didn't have a clear sense of national identity, and we do now understand the economic aspect. And then there has to be a sense that, look, that America has made tremendous progress. I'd say this about Kamala Harris. When I was growing up in Pennsylvania in the 1970s and 1980s, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in a community that was 99% white, if you had told me we were going to have an African-American, Indian-American woman who was going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party, I would have said, no way. And then she gets 48%.
Who are you kidding? Yeah, right.
She gets 48% of the vote.
Right.
I grew up, I was born in Philadelphia, grew up to parents who's in a community where I played Little League, had teachers who believed in me and said, you can do anything. As an Indian American of Hindu faith, and this country elects me to represent Silicon Valley with $14 trillion of value. This is an extraordinary country. And you can't just soundbite that. People can see whether you bleed a sense of belief in America. And to me, that's actually more than any policy, you have to believe deep in your soul that this is the greatest country, that it's a country that fundamentally aspires to overcoming difference, and that we're making progress.
Yeah, boy, I agree with that 150%. And I do think it is a central issue, central problem, central tenet that Democrats have to embrace. And, sort of part of the problem there, though, of course, is, I'm sure you know, Ro, is that the progressive activists who are affiliated with the Democratic Party are probably the least patriotic subgroup in the country, right? They are not particularly proud of being an American, and they're not particularly patriotic. And unfortunately, they punch far above their weight. And some of them support some of the policies you do, but they kind of leave out the patriotism stuff, right? I mean, it's like America, 1619, genocide against the Native Americans. I mean, Lord knows there's been a lot of terrible stuff, but America's also done a lot of great things. And again, how do you motivate people to make America, a better country? You have to embrace the fact it's still, at this point, still fundamentally a good country and has this enormous potential and so on. So, yeah, I couldn't agree with that more, but I do think it's going to be a tough sell with at least some elements of the party. My clock here says we're about running out of time here, which is too bad. I think we could go on about this for a while. Find out more about your ideas, a lot of which I find very intriguing. But any last words here for us, Ro, as you dash off to whatever else is going on in Congress?
Well, Rui, I love to do this again. I appreciate a lot of your work on thinking about the working class and how the Democrats lost them. And I think it's important for the Democrats to realize that we've got to reform, that it's not going to be enough to just count on Trump foot faulting. I guess the last thing would be that, why would you want the country's history to start at 1619 when slavery started? I mean, the whole point of America, if that's what you believe is when America started, then how do you aspire for better? The whole point is America starts in 1776 because we believe in a nation that is committed to liberty and equality, and it's the most powerful idea for political organization in the history of the world. And I really think that if we embrace our own version of the American story and have Team America as our goal, and then offer our ideas, and then we say, Khanna, we don't like Medicare for all, and we don't like the kind of focus on more taxes on the wealthy. But if we have that fundamental vision, I think we would get a lot further in making the case, and a lot further in building the case. But we'll see. I may get rejected by people, as your American Prospect article shows, people are using the word patriotism.
Well, amen there, Ro. Thanks. This was fascinating. I'm sure our listeners enjoyed it. Will enjoy it. And, keep on doing the good work you do. I, wish you the best. And obviously these are parlous times in Congress. And, hang in there and keep going with your fantastic ideas. And I hope they bear fruit. So thanks for being on the Liberal Patriot Podcast.
Thank you, Rui. And love the title of your podcast.
Right on, brother.